Picture yourself strapped to a wooden table in a crowded room. There is no needle waiting to send you to sleep. There is no kind voice telling you to count backward from 10. There is only a surgeon rolling up his sleeves, a row of students leaning in to watch, and a leather strap being tightened across your chest so you cannot move. In a moment, that surgeon is going to cut into your body, and you're going to feel every second of it. This was not a nightmare. For almost the entire history of the human race, this was surgery. Before the year 1846, an operation meant being awake, aware, and pinned down while a knife did its work. The best a patient could hope for was a swallow of whiskey, a bit of opium, and a surgeon fast enough to finish before the shock became too much. Surgeons were praised not for their gentleness, but for their speed, because every extra second was another second of screaming. Then, in a single autumn morning in a Boston operating theater, everything changed. A dentist held a glass globe to a patient's face. A famous surgeon picked up his blade. And for the first time in an amphitheater full of skeptical doctors, the patient felt nothing at all. This is the story of how humanity finally conquered the oldest enemy of medicine, pain itself. It is a story of laughing gas at carnival shows, of a triumph that first collapsed into humiliation, and of brilliant men who gave the world one of its greatest gifts and were destroyed by the fight over who deserved the credit. Stay with me, because to understand the miracle of a painless operation, you first have to sit for a moment in the world of pain that came before it. The theater of pain. Walk into a hospital operating room today, and the first thing you notice is the quiet, the steady beep of a monitor, a patient asleep, peaceful, unaware. Now erase all of that and travel back 2 centuries and step into what surgery actually was. The room was often an amphitheater, ringed with rows of benches where medical students and curious observers crowded in to watch. There was sawdust on the floor to catch the blood. In the center stood a plain wooden table, and on that table lay a fully conscious human being, awake, terrified, and about to be cut open. Because the patient could feel everything, the patient had to be held down. Strong assistants gripped the arms and legs. Straps of leather were buckled tight. Sometimes a patient was simply told to grit their teeth, or given a strip of leather to bite so they would not shatter their own teeth in the agony. And then the surgery began. There was no way to dull the pain in any meaningful way. A patient might be given alcohol until they were drunk, or a dose of opium to blunt the edges of consciousness. But neither came close to stopping the sensation of a scalpel through skin, of a saw through bone. The screams that came out of those rooms were so terrible that surgeons and students, hardened men, sometimes fled. Some surgeons could not sleep the night before an operation. Some patients, told they needed surgery, chose instead to die of their disease rather than face the table. In a world like that, the most prized quality in a surgeon was not precision. It was raw speed. In London, a famous surgeon named Robert Liston became a legend for how fast he could amputate a leg. A matter of seconds, because every second saved was a second less of a human being shrieking beneath his knife. Speed was mercy. Speed was the only mercy medicine had to offer. Now hold that image and understand the wall that medicine had crashed into. Surgeons had learned to cut, to amputate, to remove tumors, but the pain and the shock that came with it put a hard limit on everything they could do. Operations had to be quick and crude. Anything deep, anything delicate, anything that took time was simply impossible. Pain was not just cruel, it was a cage around the entire practice of surgery. A pain as old as the human race. It is tempting to think that no one had tried to solve this. In truth, people had been trying for thousands of years. The desire to escape pain is almost as old as humanity itself. Ancient Sumerians carved images of the opium poppy. Healers across the ancient world reached for whatever they could find. Wine, opium, the root of the mandrake plant, potions brewed from herbs that could make a person drowsy or numb. In the medieval world, some physicians soaked sponges in mixtures of opium and other plants, and held them over a patient's face, hoping to send them into a stupor deep enough to survive a cut. None of it truly worked. These crude concoctions were wildly unpredictable. A dose too small did nothing. A dose too large could kill. They might make a patient groggy, but they could not reliably erase the searing reality of the knife. And so, century after century, humanity was left in the same impossible place, able to imagine a painless surgery, but never able to achieve one. Over time, many people simply stopped believing it was possible at all. Pain came to be seen as an unavoidable part of illness and healing, even by some as a natural and necessary thing. There were physicians who argued that pain was essential to life, that a patient had to feel the operation for it to work, that suffering was simply the price the body paid to be healed. When the true solution finally arrived, one of the first battles it would have to win was against the belief that conquering pain was neither possible nor even proper. The strange thing is that by the early 1800s, the answer already existed. It was floating, quite literally, in the air of laboratories and lecture halls. People were breathing it in for fun. They just had no idea what they were holding. The gas that only made people laugh. Around the year 1800, a young English scientist named Humphrey Davy began experimenting with a curious gas called nitrous oxide. When he inhaled it, it made him giddy, lightheaded, helplessly cheerful. He nicknamed it laughing gas. And Davy noticed something else, something extraordinary. When he had a painful, inflamed wisdom tooth, breathing the gas seemed to take the pain away. He even wrote down the thought that this gas might be useful during surgical operations, to spare patients their agony. And then, nothing happened. The idea sat on a page and was ignored for decades. No surgeon picked it up. No one connected the giggling gas to the screaming operating room. Instead, laughing gas became entertainment. Traveling showmen turned it into a spectacle. They would set up in a hall or a tent, charge admission, and invite volunteers up onto a stage to breathe nitrous oxide in front of a laughing crowd. The volunteers would stagger around, giggle uncontrollably, sing, dance, or bump into things, delighting the audience. A similar craze grew up around ether, another vapor with intoxicating effects. Young people threw what they called ether frolics, parties where they inhaled the fumes to get lightheaded and silly. Here is the piece of the story that is almost hard to believe. During these shows and parties, people under the influence of these gases would crash into furniture, fall down, and injure themselves, and often not feel a thing until the gas wore off. The single most important clue in the history of surgery was being demonstrated over and over, night after night, in front of paying audiences. The power to erase pain was performing on carnival stages. It just took someone in that audience to stop laughing and start thinking. The dentist who finally saw it. That someone was a dentist named Horace Wells from Hartford, Connecticut. In December of 1844, Wells attended one of these laughing gas exhibitions put on by a showman named Gardner Quincy Colton. And as Wells watched, a man on the stage, deep under the influence of the gas, gashed his leg badly against a bench and simply kept going, apparently feeling no pain at all, unaware he was even injured until the effect faded. For a dentist, whose entire profession revolved around inflicting pain, this was a lightning strike. If a man could tear open his leg and feel nothing, then perhaps a patient could have a tooth pulled and feel nothing. Wells did not just wonder about it. He decided to test it on the one patient he trusted to volunteer, himself. The very next day, Wells arranged for Colton to give him the gas, and then had a fellow dentist pull one of his own teeth while he was under its influence. When Wells came back to his senses, he reportedly declared that he had not felt so much as a pinprick. It was, in his mind, a new era. He began using nitrous oxide on his own dental patients in Hartford, easing them through extractions that would normally have been small torments. Wells had done it. He had found a way to switch off pain, All he needed now was to show the world. Humbug. In early 1845, Horace Wells got his chance. He traveled to Boston, to the Massachusetts General Hospital, the most respected medical institution in the region, to demonstrate his discovery before an audience of doctors and students. This was the stage on which he would prove that pain could be conquered. It went wrong. Whether the patient did not get enough gas, or it was removed too soon, or the young man was simply frightened, the demonstration failed at the crucial moment. As Wells extracted the tooth, the patient cried out. To the crowd of skeptical medical men watching, that single groan was all the proof they needed that the whole thing was nonsense. They jeered. Someone shouted that it was a humbug, a fraud, a trick. Wells left Boston humiliated, his great discovery seemingly exposed as a failure in front of the very people he most needed to convince. It was a crushing, unfair moment. Wells had been right. His method worked. It had worked many times in his own practice. But science is often cruel about timing, and one bad demonstration in front of the wrong audience had branded a real breakthrough as a joke. Wells retreated, his confidence broken. But the idea he had planted did not die, because sitting close to Horace Wells, in his life and in his work, was another dentist who had watched all of this unfold, and who was about to take it further than Wells ever had. The apprentice and the ether. His name was William Morton, and he had once been Horace Wells's business partner. Morton was ambitious, restless, and determined to succeed where others had stumbled. He had also spent time learning from a Boston chemist and physician named Charles Jackson, a man full of scientific knowledge, and later, full of grievances. Morton became fascinated by a different substance, sulfuric ether, the same vapor from those frolic parties. Ether, he came to believe, might be more powerful and more controllable than nitrous oxide. He experimented carefully, testing it, learning how much to give and how to give it. He even designed a special glass inhaler so that the dose could be managed, open to deliver the vapor, closed to ease it off, rather than simply soaking a rag and hoping. On the last day of September in 1846, Morton put his idea to the test in his own dental practice. He administered ether to a patient and pulled a tooth. The patient felt nothing. It had worked, cleanly and completely. Now Morton had the same choice Wells once faced, and the same terrifying stage waiting for him. He approached one of the most eminent surgeons in America, Dr. John Collins Warren, a founder of the Massachusetts General Hospital, and asked for the chance to prove that surgery without pain was real. Warren, remembering perhaps the humbug of the year before, but willing to see for himself, agreed. A date was set. A patient was chosen, and medical history was about to be made in a room that still stands today. Ether Day. The morning of October 16, 1846, the operating amphitheater at Massachusetts General Hospital filled with doctors and students. They took their seats in the surrounding rows, many of them expecting another embarrassment. The patient was a young local man named Edward Gilbert Abbott, who had a tumor on his neck that needed to be removed. Dr. Warren was ready with his instruments. Everyone waited. There was tension in the air because Morton was late. He was still finishing his newly built inhaler. When he finally arrived, Warren, with a touch of impatience, is said to have gestured that his patient was ready. Morton stepped forward, held the apparatus to Abbott's face, and had him breathe the ether until the young man drifted into unconsciousness. Then Morton looked at the surgeon and told him his patient was ready. Warren took up his knife and cut into Abbott's neck, and the room, braced for screams, heard almost nothing. The patient did not thrash. He did not cry out. He lay still while the surgeon did his work, apparently lost somewhere far beyond the reach of the pain. When it was over and Abbott began to come around, he reported that he had felt no real pain during the operation, only, at most, a dull sensation. The hardened, skeptical audience sat in something close to shock. What they had just witnessed overturned one of the oldest certainties in all of medicine. Warren turned to the assembled doctors and spoke a line that has echoed ever since. "This," he told them, "is no humbug." It was a deliberate answer to the word that had destroyed Horace Wells a year earlier. What had been dismissed as a fraud was now, undeniably, real. In that quiet amphitheater, a place now known as the Ether Dome, the age of painless surgery had begun. A gift for all of suffering humanity. What happened next was almost as remarkable as the operation itself. The news moved with astonishing speed. This was an era before telephones, before radio, when word traveled by ship and letter and printed page. And yet, within weeks and months, the story of what had happened in Boston raced across the country and across the ocean. A Boston physician and writer named Oliver Wendell Holmes, watching the breakthrough unfold, proposed a name for this new state of painlessness. He reached back to the ancient Greek for a word meaning without sensation and suggested calling it anesthesia. The name stuck, and it is the word we still use today. In Europe, surgeons who heard the reports rushed to try it. Before the end of that same year, in London, that famously fast surgeon Robert Liston performed a major operation using ether, and afterward, astonished, is said to have marveled that this Yankee discovery beat anything they had ever known for deadening pain. For the first time, surgeons everywhere could imagine a completely different kind of medicine. Operations no longer had to be a frantic race against a screaming patient. A surgeon could slow down, could be careful, could be precise. People at the time understood the magnitude of what had happened. They called it one of the greatest gifts ever given to suffering humanity, an enemy that had tormented every generation of human beings who had ever lived. The raw agony of the surgeon's knife had, in the space of a single year, been defeated. Chloroform and the Queen. The story did not end with ether. Ether had drawbacks. It was irritating to breathe, slow to take effect, and dangerously flammable in a room full of candles and lamps. And so, the search continued for something better. In Scotland, an obstetrician named James Young Simpson took up that search with a particular goal in mind: easing the pain of childbirth. In 1847, experimenting with various chemicals, sometimes by inhaling them himself and his friends, until they all collapsed, unconscious, around his dining room, Simpson discovered the powerful effects of a substance called chloroform. It worked faster than ether and was easier to administer, and he quickly began using it to spare women the agonies of labor. But this new frontier ran straight into fierce resistance. Some religious authorities objected furiously to the idea of painless childbirth, arguing that the pain of labor was ordained, part of the natural and even sacred order, and not something for doctors to erase. A heated public argument broke out over whether it was right to lift this ancient burden of suffering at all. Chloroform carried a darker danger, too. It was more potent than ether, and the line between a safe dose and a deadly one was frighteningly thin. Patients died from it. Among the earliest, a young woman who lost her life during a minor operation, one of the first known deaths from an anesthetic. The gift of painlessness, it turned out, came with real risk. What settled the debate was, of all things, a queen. In 1853, when Queen Victoria of Britain gave birth to one of her children, a physician named John Snow administered chloroform to ease her through it. If painless childbirth was good enough for the Queen, the argument all but ended overnight. The royal seal of approval swept away much of the objection, and anesthesia during childbirth and surgery spread rapidly through Britain and beyond. The forgotten first and the war over credit. There is one more twist, and it is the most human and the most tragic part of the whole story. Because as soon as the world realized what a monumental thing anesthesia was, a bitter question arose. Who deserved the credit for it? Almost immediately, a fight broke out. Morton claimed the discovery as his own and even tried to patent his ether preparation, hoping to profit from it. But others stepped forward with their own claims. Charles Jackson, Morton's former teacher, insisted that he had guided Morton to ether and that the real credit belonged to him. Horace Wells re-entered the story, arguing that his laughing gas experiments had started everything, and that without him, no one would have thought to try any of it. And then there was a physician almost no one had heard of. In rural Georgia, a country doctor named Crawford Long had, back in the spring of 1842, more than 4 years before Ether Day, quietly used ether to painlessly remove a growth from the neck of a patient. He had done it, and done it more than once. But he was a busy practitioner far from the great medical centers, and he did not publish his results for years. By the time he did, the world had already crowned others. He had arguably been first, and history had passed him by. The battle over credit dragged on for years, spilling into scientific societies, into the courts, and even into the halls of Congress. It was never truly settled, and it consumed the men who fought it. Horace Wells, the dentist who first saw the answer at a laughing gas show, spiraled downward, experimenting on himself with these very chemicals until he grew dependent on them. In early 1848, at just 33 years old, in the grip of that decline and imprisoned in New York, he took his own life. William Morton spent the rest of his days battling for recognition and reward, and died years later embittered and far from wealthy. Charles Jackson, consumed by his grievances, eventually lost his sanity and ended his life confined in an asylum. Sit with the terrible irony of it. Here was a discovery that would spare untold millions of people from agony, perhaps the single most merciful advance in the history of medicine, and the small circle of men who brought it into the world found, for themselves, almost no peace at all. They gave humanity the end of pain, and it broke them. What the end of pain made possible. Step back now and look at what those chaotic, brilliant, tragic few years actually accomplished. Before 1846, surgery was a brief, brutal last resort, limited by how much agony a conscious human being could endure. After anesthesia, that cage fell away. Surgeons could take their time. They could operate deep inside the body, attempt delicate and complicated procedures, and work with a care that had simply been impossible when every second was measured in screams. Anesthesia did not stand alone for long. Within a few decades, it was joined by another revolution: the understanding of germs and the rise of antiseptic, sterile surgery. Together, painlessness and cleanliness transformed the operating room from a place of horror into the foundation of modern medicine. Nearly every operation performed in the world today, every appendix removed, every heart repaired, every transplant, every cesarean birth, rests quietly on that October morning in Boston. It became its own medical specialty, with doctors devoted entirely to the science of keeping patients safely asleep and free from pain. So the next time you or someone you love is wheeled toward an operating room, and a calm voice says you're going to drift off now, count backward from 10. Remember what that gentle moment truly represents. Remember the wooden table and the leather straps. Remember the biting strip and the rows of students and the screams that made strong men flee. Remember that for thousands of years, every human being who went under the knife went under it awake. We tend to imagine the great triumphs of history as grand and noble events. This one began with a gas that made people giggle at carnivals, ran through a humiliating failure and a war of wounded egos, and cost several of its creators their sanity and their lives. And yet, out of all that mess came one of the purest gifts humanity has ever given itself: the simple, extraordinary mercy of feeling nothing at all. The oldest enemy of medicine had finally been put to sleep, and it has stayed asleep ever since.